It's a great pleasure to welcome you in this conversation with one of the most important legal philosophers of our time. We're pleased to have Professor Frederick Schauer. He's David and Mary Harrison Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Virginia. He's also Frank Staton Professor of the First Amendment Emeritus at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, where he taught from 1990 to 2008 and served as academic dean and acting dean. He is the author of many important books in legal academia, such as Playing by the Rules, Profiles, Probability, and Stereotypes, and Thinking Like a Lawyer. Professor Schauer, thank you for joining us today.
Background, I was trained as a lawyer in the United States and Canada, but to the best of my knowledge, nowhere else in the world. Law is exclusively a graduate discipline. So I had undergraduate training in political philosophy, a little bit of undergraduate training and graduate training in decision theory in a business context, but law school came after that. So trained as a lawyer, then practiced for almost 3 years as a primarily courtroom lawyer, doing some constitutional litigation and a fair amount of commercial litigation, some criminal, mostly civil, and then became an academic after that and have been an academic now for about 40 years since all of that. So I've been in a number of different places, but I come to this with training as a lawyer. I come to the philosophical side of what I do as an academic lawyer, largely as a self-taught but not formally trained philosopher. I have been significantly influenced by the 1940s, 1950s style of analytic philosophy, very concerned with language, very concerned with precision, very concerned with understanding different dimensions of language, understanding how language works, when it's clear, when it's not clear, and so on. I've also been considerably influenced by modern decision theory, that is, thinking about what the statisticians call type 1 and type 2 errors, what other people might call false positives and false negatives. And even though I am no mathematician and no statistician and no decision theorist, the big ideas of decision theory influence quite a bit of my work in order to try to understand rules, for example, as having the ability to generate different kinds of results, and we have to trade off the false positives against the false negatives, and so on. I think it's useful in part. One of the problems with the term legal positivism is there are as many different meanings of it as there are who use the term, of people who use the term. About 40 years ago, the legal theorist Robert Summers suggested that it had so many different meanings that we should discard it entirely. More recently, both Joseph Raz and John Finnis, from different philosophical perspectives, have stopped using it. I have some sympathy with that view. I think there is the core of an idea that may capture what ordinary people think and how ordinary people, as well as theorists, understand the law, that there is something important and something different about, let us call it very loosely, written down law. That doesn't mean just written down in a constitution. It doesn't mean just written down in statutes. It basically means the whole collection of stuff, to use the non-technical term, that we might think of and ordinary people think of as law. One of the things that the legal positivist perspective enables us to do is at least understand or evaluate the extent to which judges and lawyers are making decisions and arguing in accordance with that, let us call it, limited domain of materials. And I like to think of legal positivism as a measure of how important that limited domain is in determining what lawyers argue and how judges decide. Looked at that way, for me, positivism is a descriptive variable. It's not so much that it's true or false as a matter of the nature of law, but it's a useful way of thinking about evaluating and characterizing different legal systems. I think the main challenge, at least to legal positivism as I understand it, is the existence of legal systems in which much of what lawyers argue and much of the basis for what judges decide is not contained in this limited domain of materials. That's what made Ronald Dworkin properly famous, identifying that, especially in the United States, and maybe even more broadly in common law systems generally, common law judges in ordinary cases and certainly in constitutional cases are drawing on a full range of moral materials, moral values, and often, as Melvin Eisenberg has pointed out, policy and social materials in addition to moral materials. If it is true that policy considerations, moral considerations, and all of that influence how decisions are actually made in some systems, then it may be inaccurate to describe those systems as very positivistic. I think there are two questions. First, what role do values play, and then what role should values play? So in terms of what role they do play, we ought to draw a distinction between the cases in which the rules are clear and the cases in which the rules are vague or indeterminate or ambiguous or do not give an answer to a particular case. If they do not give an answer in some particular case or instance or event, it is inevitable that whoever has to interpret the rule, apply the rule, or enforce the rule has to draw on something outside the rule, and we can call that values. They might be the values behind a particular rule, or they might be the values in the whole system, but it can't be just the rule by itself. But there's another class of events or instances or cases in which the rule seems to give an answer, but the answer that the rule gives is a morally or politically or socially or culturally unacceptable answer. That's the famous case of Riggs versus Palmer, in which a grandson murdered his grandfather in order to inherit under his grandfather's will. The law of New York at the time, this was 1890, said merely that if you were named in the will and if the person making the will was competent at the time he made it, then you would inherit. No exception for murderers, no exception for people who had murdered the person making the will. So it turns out that the law gave a quite clear answer, and the quite clear answer was morally appalling. The New York Court of Appeals, which was divided because there are reasonable views on both sides, said that the literal words, what the rule said, would have to give way to the fact that it was morally unjust to allow the grandson to inherit. It seems to me that whether we empower judges to do that or not is not something that we can answer outside of the context of any particular legal system. It depends on whether we trust the judges, depends on whether we trust the system. In systems in which there is more of a worry that judges will abuse the power, not necessarily in a corrupt way, but by making mistakes or doing something that we are worried about, it might be better to say to judges, you should put up with the occasional bad results, rather than deciding for yourself when the clear law has produced a bad result. And indeed, Jeremy Bentham, the father of legal positivism, was a very strong proponent of that, precisely because he had such a profound distrust of judges, distrust of the English common law. Where we trust judges more, where we're more comfortable with their ability to take into account policy and moral considerations, then we would be more comfortable allowing them to use values, broadly speaking, to set aside even the clearest of rules. Well, when I said policy before, that would clearly include the economic. That is, there is certainly when rules are unclear, or in the occasional case when rules generate a bad result, but when rules are unclear, or when a rule is written in such a vague way, which is more common in common law systems, that judges are empowered to make law, there is certainly a role for policy analysis in making law, and therefore a role for economics in the process of making law, which is what judges plainly do when the law is unclear. It is what they plainly do in common law systems when they are more or less officially authorized to make law. Rules are generalizations. And like all generalizations, they include things that maybe in an ideal particularistic world would not be included, and they do not include things that in an ideal particularistic world would be included. So the example I use in the book is a sign or a rule that says no dogs allowed. It is in a building, for example, or like this one, or a school or something like that. No dogs allowed is over-inclusive insofar as it keeps out, for example, guide dogs for the blind, or we can imagine other bizarre situations, but it is over-inclusive in that way. It includes things that the purposes behind the rule would not include. It's under-inclusive because suppose I want to come into the building that says no dogs allowed with my pet bear or my pet horse or my pet monkey. The same considerations that are behind no dogs allowed would suggest that people shouldn't be allowed to bring bears or monkeys or horses into the building, but the rule doesn't include them, so it's under-inclusive. That's basically the point behind the rule. That is, if every time we interpreted or applied a rule to be consistent with its background justification, then we would be applying its background justification and not the rule. The best example is an ordinary speed limit on the highway. If, for example, well, I'll put it differently. We understand that the purpose of speed limits is to ensure safety. And maybe the speed limit says 120 kilometers per hour on some motorway. Maybe on a clear, dry Sunday morning with no traffic and an experienced driver in a new car, it is perfectly safe to drive 140. If we were to say that we should apply the justification, then we would say to that driver, you are not breaking the law even if you are driving at 140. We all know, and if we don't know, we should know before our next encounter with a police officer that that's not what happens. The police officer applies 120 even if it might be safe to drive faster than that. That's the way rules operate. They cut off direct access to their background justifications. I think, at least in much of the English language literature, there is a distinction between rules in a different sense from the sense I've just been using it, rules and standards. Rules are very precise, like speed limit 120. Standards are broad and vague and give a great deal of discretion to the interpreter or the enforcer. So the American state of Montana, for example, about 10 years ago, experimented with a standard for speed limits. They eliminated numerical speed limits and just said that driving must be reasonable and prudent. That experiment lasted 2 years. People didn't know how fast they were supposed to drive. Police officers didn't know what law to enforce, so the experiment was abandoned. But basically, there is a spectrum between very clear, precise rules and broad, open-ended standards. And the question is, in what domains do we want the applier or enforcer or interpreter to be making the decisions, and in what domains do we want the rule maker to be making decisions, leaving very little discretion for appliers, interpreters, and enforcers? There's no absolute answer to that. I think there are two senses of public here. One sense of public is public in the sense of transparency. That is, people know how the decisions are made, they know the justifications, they know the reasons for the decisions, and so on. In that sense, it's totally transparent and public in that way. There's another sense of public in which we would say that decisions are made for the public, for citizens, for the population. That's just a question of what kinds of decisions are we talking about. Public in the first sense is about process. Public in the second sense is about the subject matter. In most instances, we would like public decision-making to be made in a transparent way, but I emphasize the most rather than all. After all, transparency does battle with or conflicts with other important values, including privacy, including secrecy, including the kind of confidentiality that journalists treasure when they don't want to be public about the sources of their information, and so on. In most contexts, public decision-making by public officials, we think, ought to be transparent, but I want to emphasize the most here. And once we recognize that there are competing values, we might say that public decision-making based on relatively broad known categories, that is, rules that are known in advance and people know what the rules are and how they are going to be treated and all of that, is for most purposes an essential part of democracy and probably an essential part of the rule of law. But it may be important, and this is the positivist speaking again, it may be important to distinguish the rule of law, which is a value-laden idea, with the very idea of law, which may be less value-laden. That is, there can be law in countries that do not much have the rule of law. There is law in North Korea, there is law in Zimbabwe, even though both of those countries and some number of others may fall short on a number of rule of law dimensions. Back in the 19th century, Jeremy Bentham, actually Bentham in the late 18th century, but Bentham and then his disciple John Austin developed a big theory of law around the idea that law was basically command backed by threats of force. That's how most people understand the law. That's how a number of other legal theorists in other systems and other cultures understand the law. Hans Kelsen, for example, put coercion at the center of the idea of law, or at least as a very important element of it. But in the last 50 or 60 years, at least in the English language tradition and to some extent elsewhere, coercion, law telling us what to do and threatening us with bad things if we don't do it, has tended to be downplayed as an important feature of how to understand the idea of law. I think that's a mistake. Obviously, there are some aspects of law that are not coercive in a strict sense, but so much of law is coercive that having pushed it to the side, as we've seen, as I said, in the last 50 years or so, seems to misunderstand or misconceive something very important about how law operates, very important about how it is understood by ordinary people. So the new book is an attempt, partly by a methodological reorientation and partly in other ways, to try to bring force, coercion, sanctions, and other things back into our philosophical jurisprudential thinking about what law is, what's important about it, why we need it, and how it operates. I think I am not the only person to be thinking a little bit about coercion. I think that's important. It's not so much important that I'm doing it, it's important that that seems to be a little bit of a trend. I think there is also a trend to reject essentialism. That is, one of the reasons that people have discounted the importance of coercion is that for a long time they thought that looking for the nature of law or looking for the concept of law involved trying to locate those features of law that were essential or necessary to the existence of law in all possible legal systems, in all possible worlds. More recently, people have recognized that that approach may be unfaithful to how people think, unfaithful to how people talk, and that it may be important to look for explanatory features of law that are not strictly necessary or essential. Just as we learn a great deal about birds by studying flying, even though there are birds that do not fly, so too can we learn a great deal about features of law if we stop looking for essential or necessary conditions rather than looking for typical or important ones. And I think a number of us are beginning to move in this direction.